Today is October 27th, 2016. My name is Teresa Beer Larson, and I am talking with Jim Amfahr. Jim, do I have your permission to record your face and your comments today?
Yes, you do. I'm pleased to do this. This is great.
I always ask the first question that almost everybody can reel off very fast. And when and where were you born?
I was born in Jessup, Iowa, in a little house where my other three sisters and brothers were born in a little back bedroom in the hottest summer in July of 1935, July 21st. My mom reminds me of that very often, how hot it was.
Growing up in Jessup, you probably had an opportunity to experience lots of things, as children in small communities do. Tell me about the academics and the athletics that you got to experience as a youngster.
Well, I started public school in first grade. We had no kindergarten at that time, so I went from first grade through 12th grade in the same building. It was a small consolidated school, still is called Jessup Consolidated School. Great teachers, great staff. We had lunch hour, so we walked home the half mile every day. And I found that to be true in Ames when I came here too, and I'll mention that later. But we had a good school. Kids liked each other. They were basically a farming community. So hardworking kids and good athletic programs. We had one coach that coached football, basketball, track, and then he threw in, he had baseball in the spring, which is a disaster in Iowa. And then we had, he fit in some track. He tried to make a hurdler out of me. He built one hurdle. And so that started, I ended up being on the track team at Iowa State Teachers College for a year because of that. But it was a really good place to grow up. It was a small place. Kids would get together in the city park for football in the fall and all the baseball. One of my great recollections of this, and especially later when I went into coaching, when we were 12 years old, we started a baseball team. And we had our old tattered jeans and tennies and stuff, and we went up to Old Wine, Iowa to play. They had kids in uniforms and everything else, and we had every right to be intimidated, and we won 22-3. It taught me a good lesson to not make judgments about who you're playing ahead of time. Just compete and have fun.
I know that your father was a very hardworking man. He worked for John Deere,
Yes.
and then he even shoveled coal, I believe you said. So he was basically holding down two jobs.
Yeah.
As a young man, did you look at that really hard work? It taught you something, but did it also say, gee, maybe I want to go to college?
That's for sure. He would have been pleased if I had been at John Deere's, pardon me, if I had been at John Deere's and followed in his tracks for 37 years. But watching him come home, pardon me, and unload those coal cars, as we said, with a scoop shovel, and be there from like 4 until 12 and then get up the next morning, I decided there's got to be something a little better than that. So they were pleased that I was interested in college, at that point. And I had a dear friend who happened to be the coach. His name was Dick Palm, and he came to us as about a 28-year-old guy, so he was 10 or 12 years older than we were, just out of the military. And he was the one who encouraged me to go to college, and in fact, the year after I graduated, I still hadn't decided to go, and he came back for football in August, and he said, "Where are you going to school?" And I said, hadn't really decided. He said, "You've got to go." So he's the reason I ended up at Iowa State Teachers College, and I went there a year, and then I worked at John Deere's a year because obviously I hadn't planned financially for college, and then went back for four more years at Iowa Teachers and finished in '58.
That was a very astute coach in high school that identified that you might make a good teacher.
Well, I've given him that message many times. He's still living in Springfield, Illinois, in a care facility, but I always remind him of that. He came to Judy's, my wife Judy and I were married near Dubuque, and he made the effort to be there for that. And we visited him in Arizona, where he ended up his coaching career, and he's just a dear, dear friend. Besides, I can still remember he trusted me. For some reason, he let me drive his car someplace, and I thought, man, this man, he must see something in me that I don't see in myself. But he was just a really loyal friend.
Mm-hmm. We'll want to get you. Go ahead and have a sip of water.
Thanks.
We want to get you from Cedar Falls to Ames, and there are a couple of really important people in your life that probably helped you make that transition. You mentioned your lovely wife, Judy, who you met. And who was her roommate, and how did that figure in your life?
Well, she reminded me last night that she got me this job, which is probably true, because she had a friend named Jan Hilleman who grew up near Lamoille on a farm, and they were roommates in college. Well, Jan Hilleman met Gary Trinnell, and Gary was from Cedar Falls, and he got a job here in Ames a year after I graduated. After I graduated, I had to spend 2 years in the Army at Fort Knox, Kentucky. But anyhow, then Gary called one time and said, in March of '61, he said, we have an opening down here that you might be interested in. I know you've said you want to be high school biology and coach at the high school level, but he said, come and visit. So we came down, and John Harlan was the principal at the time, and really a nice guy. He was within a few years of retirement, but just a tremendous man to talk to, and convinced me that this might be a good thing. And then I talked to Dr. Walter Hetzel. That was really a great experience. I always found it interesting that we talked about refinishing furniture and those critical things in the interview. And when the interview was over, he said, well, we have several people for this job, but he said, we'll let you know. So the next morning we got a call, and he said, the job is yours if you'd like it. It was one of the greatest things that ever happened to me. The other thing was that I had sent a letter of application to another larger school in Iowa, and it turned out the response I got from them was good too. They said, we don't hire first-year teachers. So I was eager when I found the Ames job, and it was just wonderful.
So we now have you placed in Ames, and can you give me the year when you and Judy moved to Ames?
We moved here in 1961 in August, and we lived in an apartment on the second floor of a house on Burnett, 922 Burnett. And we had a 4-year-old son at the time, Mark. And we just really were well accepted here. We were well received. Gary was one of the youngest guys on the staff at Welch at the time, so he and I ended up obviously about the same age. So we were the two young fellows on this staff who really established quality teachers. And they were very helpful to us as we grew to our roles in education.
Let's talk about some of those personalities, because this is a shared stories. There are people who watch and listen to this who may also remember some of the personalities. We'll go by departments.
Okay. Well, we'll just start with Keith Van Winkle. The kids affectionately called him Rip, of course, but I don't know if he knew that. But anyhow, he was the most organized person I had ever run across at that point. He was if they had an athletic director, he was it, because he coached football and basketball and baseball and track, and he did all those things. He was the industrial arts teacher. As I say, the most detailed guy I ever saw. He had records on everybody and all of this thing. He was on top of everything that I knew. Reba Carey was a social studies teacher, and I just loved her. She was about maybe 60, in her 60s at the time, and just really got along with kids. Always a smile, always a giggle now and then. Herb Britland was an established guy. He was an older guy. Of course, he was 48 with gray hair when I came. But being in my 20s, I thought he was elderly. Well, I've changed that attitude. He was just a sharp guy. Had been an administrator, and he was the perfect algebra teacher. Science, we ended up with Ron Bredesen in earth science for 9th grade. He came about mid-year. Can't remember if that was the first year or the second. English teachers, can't remember exactly. They all blend together.
I think there was Miss Martinson maybe, and
okay, yeah. Tilly Martinson probably.
and
they-
Mrs. Shank.
Yeah, Mrs. Shank was the librarian and probably had some English. The reason I got the job at Welch at the time was they needed somebody for PE, somebody for science, and somebody for math, because the classes were just getting big enough. We had about 4 or 5 homerooms at the time and about 25 in a homeroom, so it was a pretty small school. But just a group of people who were in control. They weren't, I was going to say they weren't domineering. In some cases they probably were, but the quality, if I could for a bit expand on the student body, I was just overwhelmed with them also. Just quality kids. It was kind of an isolated part of Ames, Iowa, because in those first years we had the privilege of working with many doctors' children, many university people, President Parks's daughter, I recall, all of these kinds of people who've gone on in a lot of cases and followed in their parents' footsteps. And so, as I mentioned earlier, it quickly came to mind that there are kids here smarter than I am. So in order to survive here, I've got to be clever and keep telling him, you may be smarter than I am, but I've got more wisdom than you do. So it was just a really wonderful place to start my career of 34 years.
Let's talk a little bit about what Welch building looked like and what it felt like as a new teacher coming to Ames. You, of course, had experience in a small school, in an older school building, so this would not have surprised you. But this was in an era when there were new buildings being built across the United States to take care of the baby boomers, such as Teresa Larson, who was coming along.
yeah.
And full disclosure, I was a student at Welch. I should, and it's really hard for me to say Jim Amfahr because I want to say Mr. Amfahr, my science teacher. When we talk about what the building looked like, it was kind of a throwback. When you walked in, describe when you walk into the building.
It depends on where you walked in. If you walked in from the west side, you walked in on the first floor. If you went out the east side, you went down a series of steps from the first floor, but actually there was a lower level that had probably half underground because there were windows down there. But so it was actually a 3-story building, and not too many things on the lower level except the furnace room, and it seems to me the shop class was down there, and there were a couple elementary classes in the building when I got there. So we had elementary children there for a while. I know there was a kindergarten. There had to be some lower elementary too, because Alberta Klein was one of the teachers who went elsewhere when we got too big to allow them to be there. It was a really well-built structure with big windows and all of this solid wood floors and all this kind of thing. It was not handicap accessible in any way. We had a young man who was in a wheelchair, and we always had the 4 strongest guys meet every time he needed to change levels. And he had to be brave as we walked down these. You'd come down halfway down, and then you'd hit a landing, and then you'd go the other half down to the floor. And they hauled Frank up and down, I can't tell you how many times in 3 years. And so kids were really eager to help each other.
There were no lockers. I'm sorry to interject.
Yeah, I was going to say we had no hot lunch program. So kids, we had actually had it seems to me maybe even an hour and 15 minutes for lunch or something. So a lot of the children would go home to their families, which means the family structure has changed from what it is today because somebody was home there to take care of them. Those that didn't go home had their lunch and they brought it to school and set it on the floor in the hallway under the hook where they put their coats. And, you know, everybody, it still amazes me that there wasn't more helping themselves to other people's lunch sacks. But that's just the way the nature of those kids were at that time. And the lunchroom was a situation where they'd go down and eat on the bleachers in the old gymnasium. The only thing that really, I think they had milk hauled in. We had coolers there for the milk otherwise. And so they would eat their lunch there and then they'd go out and play until the other kids got back from going home for lunch. It was a great building, but when we moved into the new one in the late 60s on State Avenue, obviously the kids were thrilled about that as well as the teachers.
And in that old building, for example, something that you would expect in today's building, which would be a big library and media center with computers, there was nothing like that.
No. The library, if I remember correctly, was actually on the upper level on the east side of the building, and I think it consisted of maybe 2 classrooms, what would have been 2 classrooms. But in those days, the library wasn't really used like it was later, that we can maybe talk about a little bit. Mm-hmm. It was mainly to check out books and that sort of thing, the old quiet, don't say anything in here, just whisper and check out a book and be on your way. And we had helpful people. I'm sorry I can't remember the first one who was there, but Mrs. Shank, who unfortunately just passed away not too long ago, was our librarian there right when we left.
You referred to having lunch in the gymnasium, and the gymnasium was a place where everything happened.
Yeah, everything is right. It was a tile floor on a cement surface, and so it was a hard landing if you were participating in any kind of athletics. The band practiced on stage. They would get the chairs out from the rolling things underneath the stage, put those up, put them back. John Burns was one of the first ones who did all that kind of work. We started a wrestling program there that they didn't have in junior high. And we would get the mats out every day, put them on the gym floor, put the covers on them that Coach Nichols was pleased to give us because he was thrilled to death we were starting a junior high wrestling program. They got so enthusiastic about it in PE class that they just practically demanded that we have interscholastic wrestling. So we got that going, but that was a lot of hard work. One of my favorite thoughts about that is something was so busy one time we had to go over to Iowa State and they loaned us their room under the old stadium. And Welch, by the way, was on South Highland, just 1 block south of Lincoln Way. And so we were close to the football stadium. So we were over there one spring, and I still can't imagine how we did this. Running over there and then working out and getting all sweaty and then running back, the equivalent of about 3 blocks to the school. Anyhow, one day we were over there ready to start practice, and all of a sudden all these guys, college guys, come walking in, and it's Coach Majors, and they're starting spring football. And so we had to get out of there right away. That was one of the things but they were very cooperative in that. And while I'm thinking about that, we had a parking lot at Welch Junior High that was really handy for parking for Iowa State football games. So one of the ways that the staff used to make money for the athletic program is we'd give up our Saturdays and go over there and park cars. I think it cost $1 or $2 to park there. And we'd crowd these cars in there, and then we'd get to go watch the game free and then come back and help them get out. We finally learned that it didn't help much to help them get out. One guy bumped into me one day because I was trying to hold his line up to get it. And I decided I'm not doing this anymore. So after
It
the game,
may-
we just stayed out of the way.
It may help the Welch athletic program, but it's not helping your health.
No, no.
I wanted to pick up a couple of threads of things that you've mentioned. Because I was a student in the early 60s at Welch Junior High, I would like to have you reflect on some things that I experienced. Mr. Rosheim, who was a history teacher, was quite competitive. And
Yeah, quite is quite the same as slightly. I think we could go a higher level or two. He loved anything competitive.
and he would put our names on the blackboard, and he'd have questions, rapid fire, and you had to jump up. You had to be assertive, and because everybody was dying to get enough hash marks to get an A by the end of the day, and he fed on that.
Oh, yeah.
And did you observe that as a
Yeah.
teacher?
I watched him as a golfer. I watched him as a coach in the Welch Central competition. I think he was one of the first guys where the coach was allowed out on the field to help to call the plays in the huddle, just to be sure they were doing the best job they could, or maybe move the ball another foot or so if it happened to be put in the wrong place by the official. That was Irv.
That I would
A
say
good
that.
guy.
Yeah, good. I also remember because you were in science. I also had Ms. Coulter,
Oh yes.
Mrs. Coulter, and she believed in form and
Oh yeah.
rigor.
Yeah, she was in the right department. That was a real learning experience for me because she had 8th grade science, which was called physical science. And part of their program was that they'd have to interrupt maybe chemistry or physics or something, pulleys and levers and stuff to talk about sexuality. And so when I got there in 7th grade, they had it as part of the 7th grade program. And it worked just wonderfully because we went through the animal kingdom from protozoans on up, and we learned all the terms for the reproductive process. And so by the time they got to the human being, I knew the terms. But she was one, and another gentleman who was a science teacher said, "Oh, you can't do that. You can't talk about that stuff," and they're not ready for that. So that we did it anyway, with the principal's permission, which is what was supposed to have been done. But they were a little laid back on that kind of stuff. But just a quality science teacher.
Well, those were two teachers that you hadn't mentioned, and I was
yeah,
going to just
yeah.
chime in with any other remark about that.
I do have one more story
Yeah.
about Welch Junior High. One of the first years we got there, and one of the people that I really admired was Priscilla Sage. Priscilla came from New Jersey, and I'll tell you that in a moment here, but Priscilla came and taught art. And art always fascinated me because of all the different things that kids could do. And she was a master at the freedom that she allowed kids and the flexibility she had with control. And as a young teacher, I was fascinated by that. I have to tell you a story about Priscilla. This may be all true and it may not, but over the years, this is the way I heard it. They got the word that her husband had gotten a job at Iowa State. She lived in New Jersey at the time, and they had a bunch of thugs, in her words, load the van. She wasn't looking forward to coming out west. So she gets out here, and there are a number of vet med students unloading her van, which impresses her right away. I went from this group of people to this group. Well, one of the vet med kids looks at her bird and said, "Ma'am, you've got a sick bird here. You need to call somebody." So she gets on the phone and calls, said, "I've got a sick bird. We just came from New Jersey, and could you help me?" And John Harlan, our principal at the junior high school, was the one who answered the phone. She had called the wrong number. And John said, "Well, we deal with a lot of different kinds of things," but he said, "I really can't help you here." Well, the finish to the story is the next week she comes to interview for the art job, and she walks in and meets John Harlan, who she had called about the bird. So it was really an interesting coincidence.
Well, she made herself memorable on
Yes.
a couple of occasions. I'm free associating here just about faculty members. Mr. Burns, who had the band, was so passionate about having kids. I sometimes remember him, like if the kid missed a lesson, I think would go to the classroom and.
Yes, that's true. He got criticized by some parents because of leaving the kids who were at the lesson and going to retrieve the one who had forgotten. And but he was persistent in that, and it paid off for him because by the end of the year, then they would show up on time. But just a quality guy who kept after kids, and we used to laugh about. He'd always invite me to the first 7th grade band practice. And it was a thrill.
How were your ears when you were done? I'm sorry, I would have contributed to that, Mr. Amber. I'm really sorry.
And then
I'll
at the end of the
apologize.
year, by Christmas, when they had their program, or the end of the year, why, it was just amazing to watch the kids. And that's another thing I want to interject here that just impressed me about the Welch kids. And I'm sure it's true of other places and a lot of other places, but it was okay to be good at whatever you were best at. I mean, you were praised for being a good musician, a vocalist, or instrumental person, or an athlete, or science class, or whatever, and that really impressed me a lot.
And I'm doing more free association. I think it was Mr. Fitzgerald who taught business.
He came along a few years later. He had taught in my hometown of Jessup after I had left.
I was frightened of him.
Yeah. He had a way of doing that. he was in control. I get people refer to Army sergeants. I guess he would probably have been the Army sergeant of our staff. He was the kind of guy you put in charge of lunch. Where you couldn't tolerate any food throwing or things like that, and it worked well. And he did that for years at Welch and at Central. He was a good swimming coach at Ames High because he always thought you could do more than you may be doing, but you still had some left that was there, and most of the times he was right. But he was an interesting man.
We're still kind of talking about the 1960s, and you've referred to young people who wanted to learn. They cared about learning. They came from a culture where there was a parent or parents who would reinforce that in one way or another. There were, and you also mentioned that you felt the kids were pretty smart. They were well equipped. Did you ever have problems with children acting out because they were bored? That they needed more stimulation, that they needed to get going on something?
Not that I recall. I spent most of my time in the Welch building with 7th graders. So that wasn't the situation there. 9th graders may have been a little different, but I wasn't aware of that. But I thought we had teachers like Fran Schrampfer that I haven't mentioned. She was in history, world history. I don't think you could have been bored in her class. She was also a counselor, by the way. Ada Versteeg taught Latin. You're not going to get bored in Latin. Ada, by the way, was in my homeroom. I had my first homeroom in her classroom, so I was intruding there. But we didn't have enough space, so I learned a lot from Ada Versteeg about taking care of control in kids. Of course, that was different than a classroom setting because we would meet in the morning for a few minutes and so on.
Yeah.
I think your question probably relates more where we tried to cover those things later after those years. They had a lot of activities for kids. I don't know that it strengthened them academically, but they had boys clubs and girls club, and And they had projects within those groups, like they used to have a deal where they would go to the county home around Christmas time, and there would be mostly elderly people in wheelchairs or inability to move around well, and we would take a group of kids, some musicians and that sort of thing out, and they would sing for them and so on. But in the prep to that, they would prepare bags of candies and stuff like that for them and write them notes. And that was very well received by those people as well as our kids. And so there were a lot of things like that that teachers tried to get them involved in.
Well, and there's a lesson about intergenerational activities. Perhaps they didn't live near grandparents.
Right.
There's also lessons about infirmity or the people who are different than we are that are also part of that extracurricular process.
One of the other things, and I don't know if this is the time to interject this, but one of the things that the kids still talk about from your era is the box social.
Oh, let's talk about the box social.
The box social was one of the really highlights of junior high school, and it basically involved 8th and 9th graders, if I remember. Because we had room for 8th and 9th graders. And what it was a pretty much dress-up dance. And we'd get a group in with live music, and a lot of times it was John Burns, and I forget the name of the man that was in charge of his group. But anyhow, there were 4 or 5 of them would come. And we'd have it on a Saturday night. And we'd plan for it months ahead. 8th and 9th graders, the girls would prepare a meal. They'd bring a card table. They would make a box, which is where the term came from, box social, because when the pioneers went west, if you watch the old Western movies, you'll sometimes hear about a box social, where the woman made a meal in a decorated box, and then whoever bought that thing, whoever paid the most for that, would get to dine with whoever it belonged to. And the idea was you didn't know who it belonged to. Well, that was true in the junior high, unless the girls told the boys, but there was no money involved in that. The girls would prepare the box, they'd prepare the meal, supposedly from out of the box, but not always. And they would set the table up in the gymnasium, and the boys would gather up in another part of the building, and then the boys would come down and draw a number, and they would sit at table number 12 or whatever with the 2 girls who happened to be there. So you didn't know until the last minute who you were going to be with. But Reba Carey and Keith Van Winkle were in charge of this when we came, and eventually I got part of it. But those two had it so organized, they had a dance card. And so you danced with the girl facing you across the table for dance number 1, and you danced with the other girl at the table for dance number 2. And what that did, it got the evening going right away. They would announce dance number 1, everybody's on the floor. I've been to too many teen dances in the city where the kids would stand around, nobody danced, they were just there. So they had all that taken care of. Well, then later, while the girls were down decorating the tables, they would put their boxes someplace where the boys would go vote on which one was best depicted the theme of the evening. And then they would give awards for that. So it was just a great time. The only dress code for it was we encouraged them to wear the best thing they had. And that was always good enough. We discouraged tuxedos, which later kids would buy into, but that wasn't a necessary thing. Judy and I would go and dance. We just had a great time. It was great fun. They would decorate that old Welch gym, you'd never know. I mean, they'd string wires across there, and then they'd put crepe paper streamers, and just
transform it.
to death. Oh God, it was a work. We'd actually have danced. They had some parents who would come in and have dance lessons for those who wanted to come. And that's actually back when you actually touch somebody from a distance. And they always laughed about somebody would have a ruler to keep them so many inches apart. But all in all, that was one of the really social highlights. And one of the things I used to tell the kid, partway down the dance card, they had other times when you could, after the boys and girls signed up at their table, we would have 15 minutes or so where the girls would go ask somebody, and then they'd sit down, and then the boys would go ask. And we had boys' choice and girls' choice in it. And they said, well, what do you do if somebody asks you that you don't especially like? And I said, for 3 minutes, you're going to like them. They walked across the room and said, hey, I would like to spend time with you. So grant them that. Okay. And it worked out, really. It just amazed me again how well the kids cooperated on that. But it was a thrill to do.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but if Miss Carey was in charge of that, and she was in her 60s, certainly when I had her as a teacher, I'm guessing this had gone on for decades before you got there.
Yeah, see, I don't
want to put you on the spot, but
No,
I didn't know
don't-
how long it had been going on.
It had gone on a good number of years before I got there, but I don't know how many that was.
Okay.
I don't know if it was 10 or 5.
Okay.
But they had a nice routine.
They had
So
worked
they
it
knew
out.
what was going on. Yeah.
I want to transition from your teaching experience. You eventually got a degree so you would be a counselor as well. Can you tell me about that process? And we can talk a little bit about what it was like to be a counselor at Welch Junior High.
Don Carlson talked me into that.
And he was the principal.
He was the principal. He had been a teacher at Central Junior High, and when John Harlan retired, then in somewhere mid-60s, Don Carlson got the job. So he encouraged me to do that because Fran Schramfer was the counselor, so to speak, and part-time kind of thing. And she was due for retirement before too long. So I went to Colorado, northern Colorado, Colorado State College at the time, but anyway, for 3 summers. And those people who think teachers have time off in the summers, I don't think they knew me when I was a young man, because we would get out of school here in May and be out there and get out of school like on Friday here and be out there and start classes on Tuesday. And 10 weeks of classes. One summer I remember we went through 7 textbooks. I figured out I had to read and understand 53 pages a day or I'd get behind 7 days a week. That was a good experience. We took our 2 young boys, Mark and John, out there. They were like 5 and 2 at the time, and lived in a dormitory with other people who were doing the same thing we were. So it was a nice experience. It got us hooked on Colorado, which is, we've been out there every year since 1966, except for one summer. But anyway, I got my degree in psychology, counseling, and guidance, and so when I got back here, I got that job. I was torn a little bit because it took me away from kids on a daily basis. And over the years, people asked me if I considered administrating, and I said no. I'm far enough but I always sought ways as a counselor to get involved with them. I'd go into classes and meet with them on a routine basis and and that sort of thing. We had a program. This was beyond the 60s, but we called it Relevant Problems, and we'd meet with every 9th grader at least once a week, and they could bring up any topic they wanted. And I'll just briefly state this, and then we'll go on. We told them we'd answer any questions when we were in the sexuality part of it, any questions things that they may have heard of but don't have a clue about. There were a lot of questions, and there were a lot of things that I didn't have any idea that a 9th grade kid had even heard about. Enough of that, but we tried to handle that the best we could. We tried to answer because we thought if it's a concern of yours, it's a concern of ours.
Yeah. Well, the reason go ahead.
Yeah, let me back up a little
Sure.
bit. When I started at Welch, we had 7th grade, we had a girls' science class and a boys' science class. And thank goodness that changed. It all meshed.
Mm-hmm.
And it really changed when they got to the new building.
Mm-hmm.
Because Don Carlson was one of those that got the girls involved in industrial tech, got the boys involved in family and consumer sciences. Those kinds of things were good. There were still times when we separated the boys and girls when we talked about the sexuality part.
Well, I'm definitely from the era of being separated.
Yeah.
I would have never had a shop class,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember Mrs. Sandy Johnson had me come in one time and bring my shirt in that I had just made. Judy helped me cut this thing out, and I actually sewed it myself. And she saw it one day when I wore it, and she said, "Well, that's a pretty shirt, you know." She noticed the yoke was all matched up and everything. And she said, "Where'd you get that?" And I said, "Oh, I made it." "Oh, you got to be kidding! You got to bring that into my sewing class." I told her I learned that from my mom because Mom in the war years, early 40s, when we were young people, she would take newspapers and cut out a pattern and then make clothing for the girls and us, shirts. So the unfortunate thing, and this is stepping ahead, but as time went on in the home ec department, they did less and less with cooking. And now I look and see how many young people, like in this community, are living in apartments and knowing very little about cooking. And I thought we should have been going the other way.
One reason that I wanted to ask you about counseling was to go down a path that I almost always go down in shared stories, to talk about, how did kids get into trouble in various areas and what kinds of things kids did. Not because that we want to talk about trouble, but when you talk about what children are doing, then it says something about the era. Mm-hmm. So can you talk to me a little bit about your experiences, either as a teacher in the 60s or towards being a counselor, the kinds of things that children might have done to act out?
The only thing that I can remember about Welch Junior High and where it was located, we had a grocery store across the street. Mm-hmm. And every once in a while we'd get word that they thought there was some shoplifting going on. The only thing, this didn't involve our kids, but the kids that rode their bikes to school would park them outside the fence, outside the playground. And often the kids would come in and say, "Mr. Amfahr, my bike is gone." So some college kid probably came by, was late to class, they would find him over on campus. So I know you didn't ask me about those people, but we had more problems with that than we did within the school. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that as human beings, we always seek out people like us. And if you're looking for trouble, you can find somebody else that's already there. So I remember one time, I was surprised by this, but afterwards it turned out that I shouldn't have been. We had, kids told me that a boy had cigarettes in his locker, and of course you weren't allowed that. That was in the new building, just really. So I went and got the young man and asked him, and he said, "Yeah, I've got him in there." So he opened it and got him out. So we went into Mr. Carlson, and he said, "Well, we've got to call your folks, because you're not allowed to have them in school." The first thing the mother said when she walked in the door is, "How did you get them?" And I thought, that's too bad. That's too bad. Yeah. I said, "He gave them to me." I at that moment, I had more respect for the child than I did the mother. Kids were openly honest in junior high. I love that about them. People tell them, you tell people you spent 34 years with grades 7th, 8th, and 9th, and they look at you a little differently. And you tell them you do it all over again given the same circumstances, because they just were. I felt sad when we went from 7th, 8th, and 9th grade to 7th and 8th grade. And that was practical because of this situation for space in Ames. The ninth graders went to the high school, but our 7th and 8th graders used to learn so much from that older age group. I mean, and that's what really happened at Welch in the old building. The ninth graders, a lot of them were on courtesy committee, which meant you stood out in the hallway and you helped anybody who needed help. And you know, somebody's jacket might have fallen off the hook and gotten kicked down the hall, and they're sad about it, and somebody helps them find it. Helping carry the disabled wheelchair kids and all that kind of stuff.
Well, you had a very good relationship with students on so many different levels. I hear you saying that they would share with you something that happened, and there was a kid who had a firecracker on a bus, something about that.
We got word that a bus had stopped over just on Lincoln Way by Hilton Coliseum because somebody had lit a firecracker and thrown it under the seat. I forget what they were. They were little round balls, like jawbreaker size. And of course, when the kids got to school, about 6 of them came in and told me who did it. Well, the word was that, I'll name him Charlie. It wasn't Charlie, but we'll just say Charlie had to go in and see the principal, and he said, no, he didn't do it. So I heard that, and I came over and talked to the principal, and he said, well, you talk to him. This was John Kinley, our new principal at the time, so this was quite a bit after Welch. But anyway, he walked into my office, and I asked him, you know, tell me the situation. He said, well, I didn't do that. So I said, well, what we're going to do, Charlie, is you're going to get up from my office, go out in the hall, and stand there for a moment and rethink this, and then come back, and we'll start over. So he came back in, and I said, now I want to hear the true story. Well, I did it. He said, how did you know? And I said, well, your friends told you because they were worried about you. So we talked about that a little bit. I really appreciated the fact that kids would do that. And, you know, in our society, that would be a good thing if that happened all the time.
Yes.
But anyhow, I said, now you've got the problem of talking to Mr. Kinley. You want to do that by yourself, or do you want me to come and sit with you? Well, I'd like it if you'd go along.
Well, there's another layer of trust there.
Yeah, I just told him that I introduced him to Mr. Kinley again and said he has something that he'd like to share with you. And so we worked that out, and I appreciated that. We did a lot with counselors on the behavior side of it, just getting along. One of the saddest things I had to do as a counselor was one time a young man had an accident, and his parents called and said they'd like to have me go get him out of class and have him report home, and we'd like to tell him.
So
his older brother
had an accident.
Had an accident, and it had died, and that was not a pleasant situation. And the other one is I had an 8th grade girl, the only one that I dealt with, who came in and told me that she thought she was pregnant. And so I asked her if she told her mom, and she said no. So I said, well, we need to let mom know. So we got on the phone and invited her to come, and I can still remember her parking the car out front because all the kids were there. It was in the morning. And so she wanted me to go out and tell her mom. So I went out and told her. And she said, well, why would she tell you? And I said, well, she trusts you, she trusts me. She loves you, she doesn't love me.
Well said.
She said, well, thank you for doing that. And unfortunately, I can't tell you what happened in the situation.
Yeah.
I have another thing that I always laughed at because I couldn't figure a way out of this one. Teacher comes to me and he says, I'll use Charlie again. Charlie has really bad breath. I mean, every day he comes to class and I just can't stand it. And he needs help because he's not doing it. And I thought, oh, just what I want to do as a counselor, meet this kid who I don't really know very well, but So one day he was walking out of school and I walked out with him and there was nobody around. Nobody. So I said to him, well, you know, the teacher tells me that, you know, you might help yourself with gum or freshen up. And well, I get a call that night from Mr. Carlson that I need to be at school at 7 o'clock in the morning for a meeting with this child's parent. She is just fuming because I told her child that he had bad breath. And I have never figured out, I thought I was doing him a favor. I told her the circumstances. I told him no one knew. No one's going to know besides you, except now Mr. Carlson knows because you. But those are the ones that were the tough ones. But I used to love to work with kids on. We would give IQ tests back then. I learned a lot as a counselor because after the tests were over, they would never take it again in their life. So I would bring them into my office 5 or 6 at a time, and we'd go through every question. And I was just amazed at how clever some of the questions were, because you could arrive at the answer in different ways. And that taught the kids a lot too, I think. And that was one of my big jobs as a counselor, to give Iowa tests and basic skills. And we did those in each room at Welch when I got there, but in the new middle school, which was Welch, the new school was Welch, we did it in the auditorium by grade level. Kids really did a good job with those.
Well, I think you've alluded to the fact that there was a fairly strong academic culture in general. So when you think about Ames teenagers, they're the preteens, over your 34 plus years in the public school system, in what ways did the Ames kids parallel the nation, and in what way were Ames kids different?
Well, early on, I think they were way above in their expectations for themselves and what their achievements that they reached as followed them through the years. Excuse me. I'm sorry, I lost it.
Oh, we were just talking about how Ames teenagers, if they paralleled the nation in similar ways, or did they diverge? Different?
I think oftentimes they followed in their parents' footsteps, at least for a while, which is true in my hometown or anything. If you were a farm kid, you ended up being a farm kid.
Right.
I think that changed when we went to the new junior high school on State Avenue, because then they started busing. And I think the kids got involved. It was more of a realistic thing, well, obviously of Ames, but also of Iowa. And Iowa used to, Ames did well in Iowa. Iowa always tested well in the nation, and Welch did well in Ames, Iowa. So it was more realistic. There were wider range for teachers to work with. There was no question about that.
It just occurs to me, speaking of competition, there were 2 middle schools in town, 2 junior highs, and that was for a certain time period, and then of course it combined into one middle school.
One middle school. And
Are there any stories about competition between Welch and Central that you can tell me?
There may have been competition between the kids, which there really was, but probably more among the teachers that we found out. Well, you knew when you had academic competition or athletic competition, you never wanted to lose to. When I started at Welch Junior High, we were about half the size of Central, or less. So anytime we competed, we were at a disadvantage. I can still remember fondly, as it turned out, that we used to do very well wrestling. And this one year, after having beaten Central several years in a row, they beat our 7th grade team. And the coach at the time said, well, we'll see how this goes now the next 3 years. When those 7th graders or 9th graders, at the end of the year, we beat them. And I didn't remind him of it, but I remembered it for those. I told our kids ahead of time. So that was my personal experience with it. Another one dealt with wrestling also. Jim Gibbons and the Gibbons boys. Jim wrestled at Central. I was fortunate to have Jeff and Joe wrestle at Welch for a while. But Jim told me one time, we were just sitting chatting, and by the way, his dad and I had the same great-grandmother. We found that out when Jeff was in school. But Jim was talking about competition. Now this is a guy who was like 76-1 in high school, won a national collegiate title, finished 3rd and 7th the other time. And he said the most nervous I ever was in wrestling was the Welch Central Wrestling Meet, which really surprised me. I can't remember who his opponent was, but I mean this guy had wrestled hundreds of matches. So that would give you some idea of how the kids
How intense how the young people
Yeah.
perceived it.
Yeah.
I think I would love to know more about what you initiated for Welch Junior High, and which later became the Ames Middle School, because you did leave an imprint on, in a very good way, some of the things that you started that are still carrying on today. We've talked about the wrestling program, but you haven't talked about how it got started.
Well, we initiated it in PE class, like I said, and the kids just dearly loved it. And then we had tournaments with homeroom kids who weren't out for wrestling necessarily, who would come and do that as after we'd have some time in PE class. And it just rolled into that. And we had some really good programs in the 70s. Your brother Steve was on a team that was one of my best ones ever. I'll show you the trophy, by the way, when we get done here. I just found it yesterday. When they combined Welch and Central, they wouldn't let you keep any of the old stuff, so I brought some of that home. But anyhow, we went over to a tournament. We'd won it like three times out of 4 years, and one of my dear coaching buddies over there said, Amfahr, he said, next year we're going to make the second place trophy bigger than the first one. And the other thing I got a kick out of in wrestling, and dear friend down in Ankeny, his name was Walt Krameyer, and we used to sit down before wrestling meets and plot out who was going to wrestle and write their names on the score sheet and all that. And he told me about every one of his kids and how tough they were, and of course I listened. And we won the meet 36-6. And he shook hands with me afterwards, and he said, doggone, Amfahr, he said, you let me make a fool out of myself. I said, well, I thought they were interesting stories. So we got a laugh out of that. The things that I really enjoyed, too, were starting the academic things. Because as a counselor, we got invited, like, to Webster City. Well, we got invited to Ankeny first. So we would have, it was kind of like a Jeopardy thing.
Sort of an academic bowl,
Yeah.
sort of thing.
Yeah, and first response, quick response, and of course it had to be accurate. But we got invited to that, and then we started our own program with that. And Don Carlson bought us machines where you'd have 4 kids and you'd punch it so the moderator could sit there and read the question and know who had first chance at it. We did all that. We did that for many years, and the kids really loved it. I still have kids that say, I'm really glad we started that. Mm-hmm. But as a spin-off, kids got to the high school and they didn't have anything like it. And they said, how could we go about doing that? And I said, just keep after them, tell them we've got it. So they do things like that. Don Foss used to do things like that at the high school with auto mechanics. Other spin-offs of that, after we got that started, then they had mock trial, which is a big thing still. And one of the guys that went in the special ed program, he was with the same 4 or 5 kids all day long with special needs. And Bruce Anton was his name. And I said, Bruce, you need to take over one of these programs where it's, where the kids are really stimulated. So he did, and he really loved that. So it helped the staff out as well as, the highlight of that whole thing was in 1991, we had 12 kids, I think it was 4 7th graders and 8 8th graders, who were in the Knowledge Master Quiz, a national contest. And we got, in the mail, we got the results with a plaque that said they had been first in Iowa and first in the nation out of middle schools our size, and that there were 1,305 teams entered, and those 12 kids
Wow.
won that competition.
Wow.
You had to be quick and you had to be accurate.
Uh-huh.
And I had a picture in my notebook of we took them to the school board, and they were recognized there as being national champs.
Well, as a teacher, you're going to appreciate my preamble here to this. This is my second to last question.
Okay.
You know, so you're coming to the end of the experience. Are there events at Welch or even Ames Middle School that are remarkable for, listen to this series of adjectives, if there's anything you want to contribute, funny, touching, inspiring, instructive, divisive, tragic, healing? Any other incidents?
Well, the one that I recall most tragic was, of course, John Kennedy, and standing in front of the kids and telling them that their president had been killed by some unfortunate fool. And like all of us have experienced, we could say where we were standing. I can still remember standing there facing west in that science or math classroom. I can't remember which one, but that was tough for the whole staff to have to share with the kids at that time.
And I'm just going to reflect on that, but I don't mean to cut you off. We'll come back to it. You may have another idea just after that. We talked about Mr. Rosheim and his competitiveness, but he was our history teacher at that time, and there was a stableness and a sensitivity that I hadn't seen before. So as a student, seeing that side of a person, you know, delivering tragic news was revealing for a student.
Yeah, and that was tough. The other tough one was I had a secretary. She was in our student services. Her name was Pat Dale, and she was killed on her way to school. And so that was really sad day. Another one that was really sad was when Mary Ann Carlson was struck by a school bus. Don had just decided that he would retire, and I was in his office, and I got the phone call to come down to the hospital. So he handed me the telephone, and I got the information, and we went down, and she had, on 13th and Duff, she had been walking south in her morning walk, and the bus had turned into the sun and had not seen her and knocked her down. It happened to be a school bus. And long story short, she's fine. She came on, but she was in a coma for a long time. That was a sad situation to work through it in school.
So my final question, which I ask absolutely everyone, is there anything that you would like to tell me that I haven't thought to ask you regarding your Ames school system experience over those more than 3 decades?
It gave me a lot of opportunities that I would have never had otherwise. When our second son, John, graduated from high school that fall, his little brother and I, Mike was 10 years younger than John, so little Mike and I were walking to the first football game that fall. And we were coming across the practice football field, and they were playing the national anthem. And I walked in, and Tom Jorgensen said, "Would you help us up in the press box?" I thought, yeah, it'd be fine. I said, if Mike can be up there with me. And he was just a little guy, I can't remember how old, but anyway, I went up there and he said, "We'd like to have you help us with the radio." I said, let me rethink this. No, he said, there's a guy, Rich Fellingham, is new to town, and I was going to help him, Tom said, but he said, I can't. I'm the athletic director, and I just can't. I need to be out with the crowd. So I sat down with Rich, and we put the headset on. I wrote my name down for him, because the game had already started. At halftime, we introduced ourselves to each other, and that went on for 13 years.
And I think you got to call some other games
Yeah.
as a result of having that
did.
happenstance.
The thing that really helped in Rich's mind was that I knew all the kids, and as a color commentator, I was looking at the cool kid who was playing guard, the guys you never hear about. I was a real name dropper. I buy it on purpose, because those kids really play hard too.
Yeah.
And because of that, they won the Sports Broadcasting of the Year award, and they let me have my picture with them. I got to do a Oklahoma-Iowa State women's basketball game in Hilton Coliseum. I got to do high school football playoffs in the Unidome. Baseball championship in Marshalltown, all of these kinds of things. And one of my very favorite things is, I think I'm probably one of the few guys who ever got to coach Fred Hoiberg in basketball and Harrison Barnes. And Harrison Barnes, of course, was just, he and Fred were just very, very special people. And Harrison ends up in the Olympics this year. It was great fun. A little kid from Just Iowa, I never dreamed I'd have got to do that. I had great kids in wrestling, Bill Kunerth and the Gibbons kids that I've seen, and your brother Steve. It was just fun when they came to practice. We just had great fun. Mark Barnett, all of those guys. And so Judy and I have just been thrilled. She taught here for 30-some years too. In fact, she just walked in the doors where she was tutoring second grade up at St. Cecilia's volunteering, and she's still really good at that. So now we're so grateful our three boys went through school here in Ames, Iowa, and that prepared them well for what they're doing. So thank you, Teresa. This has been great fun. I mentioned to you when you walked in this morning, it's like preparing for exams. All week long I looked back on kids that Judy mentioned. We first went to visit. We went to Whit Ayers' folks when we were first in town for a dinner. He's now at the University of South Carolina. He's a nationally renowned politician, expert on politics. We went to John Burroughs, Wise Burroughs, that was his name. We went to John Burroughs' family. They had a beautiful home just west of Westgate, and now it's all been plowed over and it's got housing in it. But those were great experiences for us as young people, coming to town with a child and then be accepted by the staff at Welch Junior High and the people. And it's been a great road. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with me. I've enjoyed it very much because I was just on the path that you were on for just a little bit, but I'm glad that we had that shared experience both then and now.
Again, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Girls would prepare the box, they'd prepare the meal, supposedly from out of the box, but not always.